So now this will be the last call of the talk of the day and of TEX. So thank you, Nicola, from the Basque Center on Cognition, Brain and Language. The audience is yours.
Okay. Well, first, thanks for the invitation and the nice set of speakers. I think that my presentation is touching of many points that I heard across many talks. But first of all, I would like to start with first giving credit to the main actors and of all this research, Michael, Anastasia, and Pier Matteo, that have been worked, however, in collaboration with all the members of my team that I would like to acknowledge, first of all. So today, the presentation is centering about the idea of cortical tracking of speech. That is still largely debated phenomenon, but can be defined as a coupling between the temporal structure, so the amplitude modulations of the speech envelope, and the brain signals that can be recorded simultaneously. I think that I added here the term oscillatory, that is still debated, mainly because from what we studied in the last 6 to 7 years, what we observe is the fact that our brain or auditory system can track multiple temporal structures with at different frequencies. And in general, the two main phenomena that we observed are at a very low frequency, in this case below 4 Hertz, that it's pretty difficult in speech to define what really reflects, but I think there is an agreement that reflects some sort of phrase boundaries, but also theta band oscillations that track more the syllabic structure of speech. So I think that this is these are the data, but what does this really reflect? I think that the initial idea was the idea of entrainment. So somehow our the amplitude modulation of the signal would modulate the activity on the auditory cortex, and this will be really relevant both in general audition or in speech to sample. To focus on the content of speech in envelope salient segments, either at the phrasal or the syllabic level. So this view enhances the fact that the input is really important. However, in the last years, I think that I think that I changed the term entrainment to the term tracking. That involves a more active, if you want, predictive way of estimating the timing of those famous speech units that are relevant and that are critical for speech recognition. So somehow I think that there is a general you probably shared that identify two types of components. One is the fact that at the end, the oscillator, the cycle of an oscillator works really well as a clock to modulate the timing of perceptual processing. So somehow this could give some sort of predictive way of adapted to the syllabic, to the phrasal rates that are quasi-rhythmic of the input, of the speech input. It's important, however, that these stimuli are quasi-rhythmic, they're full of irregularities. And in this case, this oscillator is controlled and its phase could be reset online to adapt to the ongoing oscillatory changes. So I think that somehow in both cases, we see some sort of predictive, if you want, top-down modulation. This led to many questions in our lab, many open questions about this phenomenon of cortical tracking of speech. So one first question is that if in normal speech, if I know what is going to be the next word, the next segment, the next syllable, would this alignment between the envelope and the brain activity being enhanced? And second, if this is possible, what is the role of language experience, language proficiency? So if this phenomenon at the end is controlled by this knowledge of these regularities, this should be sensitive to our experience to that input. And finally, I think that's something that it's really interesting, and it emerged before yesterday in some talks. How does language experience shape in general auditory processing? So, and this connects more or less to question 2, and we will see how. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first point, and bringing some data that we collected with EEG. So in this case, we presented our participants with continuous speech, in which there were target words that were embedded, and within the local context, those words could be, I think, highly predictable or less predictable, not predictable at all. And what you typically observe in these cases is that the less predictable words elicit more negative amplitude responses in the EEG, around 400 milliseconds. This is the classical M400 effect that I report here on the right, in which minimally constraining context elicited more negativity than highly constraining context. Probably because the integration, the semantic integration is more difficult, so many things. But the critical point is that for this time interval, exactly this same data, we also evaluated the tracking. And we used the phase locking value measure to see how the ongoing EEG activity was phase locked to the envelope of that particular word. And so what we were expecting is that the cortical tracking in this case should be higher for the low predictable compared to the high predictable compared to the low predictable condition. And we observe actually the opposite. So in this case, the phase locking, more or less in the M400 time interval, was higher for the less expected word compared to the highly expected word. So this was an interesting finding that made us think about, so first of all, that there is a role of language knowledge, this is contextually, this is an expectation for the incoming word, but also for the temporal structure of the incoming word. So we were not clear, we did not have clear what was the trade-off between these two sources of information, the content, the lexical item, the lexical representation, if you want, and its temporal structure. So in the following experiment, we try to modulate independently in a 2x2 design these two factors. So we had, in this case, sentences in which the target word could be highly expected or less expected. However, what we did in this case, we also modulated the temporal structure of the previous context. that could be either normal or can be jittered. So here there is an error. This should be jitter. So what happens here is that we had natural speech, or a condition in which randomly some segments were either shortened or lengthened. So this is evident here, in which this is a lengthened segment before our target word. The target word did not change. We had natural sentences. We computed the surprisal of our target words, and as you can see, we had two clear independent distributions for the high expected and the less expected. And in MEG, what we measured was both the coherence in this case to the previous context, of in general to the overall sentence, but also how what is important, how the trial by trial MEG data could be explained by the surprisal of the target word using a representation similarity approach. So first, concerning the coherence analysis, remember what we saw before, higher tracking for the less expected condition. So here the situation is the following. So first of all, in the we have data for independent data for the theta band. Remember the syllabic component and the phrasal component, the delta band. And in the theta band, we found a clear effect of jitter. So the non-jitter sentences could be tracked better with more coherence in the syllabic rate compared to the jittered ones. No effect of, in this case, of expectation. So it seems that the system prefers a structure, a prosodic structure that is with which it is familiar. Importantly, we also observe an effect in the delta band, something that I call more the cognitive, if you want, band. And independently of the different lines, we found an interaction, but what is important is that in the normal condition, the high expected and the low expected are clearly different. So here we have the blue one showing higher tracking compared to the red one. And again, the higher tracking emerges for the less expected condition. Final data point for this study was what happens with at the target word. So first of all, I have to mention that both in jittered and in normal condition, we have clear M400 effects that are reported here below. However, when we look at the surprise, how surprisal explain point by point our MEG data time locked to the target word, the effect was much robust and statistically more significant for the normal speech compared to the jittered speech. So showing that familiarity with the normal rate unaffected is relevant also for building up clear lexical semantic expectations. More refined, if you want, lexical semantic expectations. So the question is, the first question is answer is no, because CTS is enhanced mainly when the word is minimally constrained, and probably the effect mainly is emerging in the delta band, the phrasal one. But there is a but. In this case, we have to keep in mind that the system was able to track better in the theta band to regular speech, and this was associated, not necessarily causally associated, but was associated with clearer surprise effects at the target word. Okay, so where this prediction come from is a classical question, and to answer this question, we focus on language learning. So what we did in this study was presenting continuous speech, 5-6 minutes of continuous speech to language learners, either in their native language or in a language that they were learning. For this case, they were native speakers of Spanish and they were learning Basque. So we had the 3 groups that can be nicely dissociated based on their behavioral scores. What we did was again measuring the coherence, so this phase alignment between the ongoing envelope structure and the MEG activity. But also we did an additional analysis, a transfer entropy analysis, that is a connectivity analysis in which what we were looking for were oscillatory activity across the whole brain that could reduce or explain, if you want, the oscillations happening in the auditory cortices. And so that's why I'm saying I'm using the term predictive, because you have something happening earlier in time that explains what happened later in time across multiple legs. But we can debate about this term. So first of all, for the coherence analysis, we clearly find an effect of proficiency. So both in our delta and in our theta range, the tracking was better for the native compared to the second language. What is important is that across our 3 groups in the auditory cortices, both delta and theta tracking were linearly related to proficiency, being higher for the higher proficiency compared to the lower proficiency. The effect in the native language was not different across the 3 groups. What is more important now is that which brain regions modulate this tracking. And the answer is again complex in the sense that we have 2 stories here. One story for the delta band. So for the delta band, the transfer entropy that explain auditory tracking in the delta band was involving a set of regions. Probably a stronger effect was in the left IFG. But it's important what I'm highlighting here below, that is the fact that these transfer entropy scores were proficiency related only in a subset of all these regions. That is the left IFG. So in this case, the top-down modulation is stronger depending on your proficiency, and also in premotor and motor regions. So the second part of the story comes for the theta band, for this syllabic tracking. And in this case, the higher effect that we found was in the middle temporal regions, plus again the premotor regions. So it's interesting that we find some sort of dissociation between 2 classical regions, kind of Broca and kind of Wernicke, affecting auditory cortex activity. So the answer in this case is yes. CTS is modulated in different bands. So the delta band is mainly seems to be specific from the left IFG and the theta from the left MTG. And in both cases, there was a role for the premotor regions, but also in the delta band for the motor regions, as being previously observed. What is relevant here is that this top-down modulation is proficiency sensitive. So depending on how much you know or you're familiar with the given language, the more the top-down modulation and the following cortical tracking changes. So probably we can speculate that there is a differential role probably for more syntactic representation in modulated phrasal tracking in delta band, and the lexical information in tracking of syllabic in the theta band. So given this strong influence of language representations on auditory processing, so we kind of were left again with the question, so this modulation is mainly driven about, is explained mainly by lexical information, language abstract information, or is more related to some sort of estimation of the timing of the prosody of the speech. And so, kind of try to answer this question, we said, okay, if this effect is so strong, we should observe also with stimuli that are not language dependent. So in this case, what we did was playing with, again, with Basque and Spanish that are two-syllable based languages, but that have a clear different structure. With Spanish being a functory initial language in which short words or function words preceding content words. So this is called some sort of, reflects a sort of iambic prosody in which short precedes long, while Basque presents the opposite case. So in this case, function words are at the end, follow the content word. And this is reflects as some sort of trochaic prosody. So based on this, we can think about different ways of dealing with auditory irregularities based on long-lasting experience with a specific language. So what we did was using an omission response paradigm in which participants were presented with sequences of tones that can be short and long alternatively. And once in a while, what we did was omitting one of the two tones, either one short or one long. And what we measured was the evoke response to these omissions in a M&M paradigm, some sort of prediction error response to these sequence regularities in two groups, a Spanish dominant and the Basque dominant group. So what was our prediction? Was given their experience with a given language, we could expect a more salient mismatch response for the Basque group when a long tone is omitted, because that long tone reflects the onset of a cluster of long short. While the opposite should emerge for the Spanish group, that should present more sensitivity to the omission of the short tone. In this case, what we observe is first, this is the overall effect of omission responses. For people that like absence of stimuli, here the omission response is much stronger compared to the presentation of the tone. So really a strong prediction error response, if you want. But it's interesting that we observe that Basque speaker present a stronger, larger response to the omission of long tones compared to Spanish speakers. And interestingly, the opposite emerged for the omission of short tones, in which Spanish speaker presented a larger response. So yes, the exposure to a given prosodic structure affects also the how we cluster sequences of bits. Forgot to mention that in this case we also had the case in which the two pitch were higher, the two tones were high pitch or low pitch, and we did not observe any interaction between the groups and that type of omission. And this somehow is evidence for cross-domain interactions for the models that somehow trigger predictive perceptual mechanism. So going back to our initial shared view of cortical tracking of speech, this idea of the oscillator as a clock that is modulating timing of perceptual processing. So yeah, I think that it's kind of supported by some of the data. because in the theta band, the system prefers a more regular and familiar speech stimulus. And this could potentially have consequence of how we integrate word by word the linguistic information. And so somehow, however, this mechanism is not blind to the external stimulus. It cannot be blind to the external stimulus because it's highly modulated from a top-down component. And I see probably two modulators, if you want, and one that is more some sort of attention related, probably closer to the idea of phase reset, in which when you have to adapt and place more weight on the tracking of the input if the input doesn't have a pre-activated mental representation available. But also another more linguistic level in which that somehow counterbalance this, let's say, attentional component, that is the linguistic component, in which the familiarity with a specific temporal structure is relevant for modulating and probably modulating the tracking in the auditory cortices, even beyond pure speech. So again, let me thank the whole group and all our funding bodies. And if you want to follow us, well, we are on Twitter, on Brico1, and hope you will find more interesting stuff that we have published.
Thank you very much, Nicola. So we can have our last series of questions before going to the roundtable. Yes, Floris.
Hi, thanks for that nice talk. So I actually have a bit of a technical question. So it's not super interesting maybe, but I was curious about your the cortical speech tracking where you present sort of side by side the sort of larger N400 for minimally constraining compared to highly constraining words, and then also higher PLV values, right? Higher face values. So I was wondering, isn't it possible that one is then just a consequence of the other? That if you have a larger signal, you typically also have larger consistency across trials. And the M400 signal is a phase-locked signal, so that you would sort of automatically also get stronger PLV values for the minimally constraining. Or is there really something different, you think, in that?
Okay, the PLV values here are not inter-trial phase locking, but they are each trial, the phase locking with the envelope of the stimulus. So first, and second, so in this case, what we use phase locking value, the PLV, because actually it's a measure that is not really sensitive to the amplitude of the signal. So that's why we thought that it could be an interesting complementary evidence that doesn't overlap with the M400 evidence.
Yeah, I'm not sure if everybody would agree with that latter point. I think you can estimate the phase better if a signal has a higher amplitude, because so signal to noise ratio matters for the ability to calculate.
Absolutely, yeah. However, yeah, we're talking about signal to noise ratio, absolutely agree. But I mean, we're talking about signal to noise ratio of two signals that are relatively similar in signal to noise ratio. It's even if the M400 is larger, we're not. Remember that the M400 is an ERP, and the ERP is extracted for a noise that is orders of magnitude that is larger. So what we are observing is that noise and that effect. So probably I agree that the PLV can be sensitive to the signal to noise ratio, but I think that on probably on other orders of magnitude.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you. We go with one question from an attendee now, Fernando Ramirez.
Sorry, I'm adjusting my headset. And Nicola, thank you for the talk.
You're welcome.
And I think this is all like really interesting, especially to find like differences in auditory processing, reflecting like internalized speech structures, like affecting beat. Like I found that really fascinating.
Yes.
And a little bit going along, just it's a boring question, so sorry for that. But it's a suggestion a little bit related to what Floris de Lange just proposed. So I encountered in similar fields somehow delicate and subtle effects of SNR on the estimation of angles of vectors. So in the end, the angle of a vector is very similar to a phase of an oscillator in a way. So if you have a stable signal and an unstable signal, or a high SNR signal, which would be the envelope of the speech, and then you have your brain signal, and there are differences in SNR among those measurements, that would lead to strong effects in the angle of those vectors. So if the vector is short, then the angle changes a lot. If the vector is long, then the angle changes little. And this translates quite transparently to the case of phase locking values. Mm-hmm. So I guess that it would be really useful to strengthen that argument, which is like a really nice one, to maybe simulate the sensitivity of that effect to estimates of SNR. Mm-hmm. So and then maybe that would help to strengthen the argument, further. So because stronger SNR implies better estimate of the phase, which will translate in a higher phase locking value. So I was wondering if you have ideas on that, or if it makes sense to you even. I'm mostly speaking from fMRI, so I don't know how if you feel it translates properly to your literature.
No, so okay, this is a really technical question, and my idea on that. Well, first of all, I have to admit that the effect is really small, and that's why we run the second experiment, in which we use coherence, in which we have larger set of data. And in that case, I was curious to see what happens with across the whole context, because at the end, in the previous study with the PLV, we were looking at a very small segment, and the possibility of having a positive, a false positive was pretty high. However, when you are building up your expectation, is not something that emerges at a specific point, but it gradually emerges across a whole segment or a whole set of words. So looking at larger sets in the second experiment and observing almost the same, well, actually the same effect, was really was more reassuring about what we were observing in the first study. Actually, I used more the first study as a sort of teaser of the second one. And also in the second one, we use coherence and not phase locking value, because I agree, the phase locking value especially can be really sensitive to SNR, as we said. And I think the coherence was more stable, yes.
Thank you. That makes a lot of sense.
Thanks. And we don't hear you.
Sorry, I was mute. Thank you, Fernando. Now, Padraig, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, I would. Thanks a lot, Nicola. That's a really wonderful natural experiment you've got in your setting in Basque country for this comparison. I was really interested in this iambic trochaic difference because wondering about whether this is prone to training through language, or whether it's whether you start with some sort of biases or priors towards certain rhythms. Because I'm thinking about the way that physical events are structured. You tend to get this lengthening of the final segment of an action, just as you do tend to get final lengthening of segments in speech and syllables within words. But this seems like, at least at the phrase level, it'd be reversed in the Basque participants. So I wonder whether there is any sort of cognitive initial resistance to accepting those patterns in the phrase structure in Basque.
So I think that, well, if there is resistance, I can tell you yes, because I'm trying to learn the language and it's really resistant to me. But as Italian, but yeah, I think that one important point that I did not mention is that that experiment was inspired by a previous very simple experiment in which those sequences were presented to participants, and they had to say, what did you listen, long short or short long? And across actually many more groups, the trend was really nice, going from one side to the other in their preference. So even in this very direct and explicit task, the effect was emerging. So it seems very stable. I have, from the learning point of view, I'm not aware of any study that try to clash these two structures, one against the other, in an artificial learning paradigm. But this is a good idea, to see if Basque dominant people somehow could have more difficulties in switching to the short-long.
I just wonder if, like in visual sequences as well, if you have sort of a lengthening or shortening of the first or the last element of a visual sequence, whether there might be different preferences in those stimuli too.
Cross-modality, that would be really strong evidence, absolutely.
Yeah.
But I'm not aware of any study, and well, it's a good idea.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.